So I'm delighted this evening to welcome our speaker, Katya Hoyer, who is an Anglo-German historian. She was born in Germany, but is currently based in the UK, and is a visiting research fellow at King's College London. She's also a columnist for the Washington Post and also writes for other newspapers here in Britain and in Germany. You may have come across a recent book, which is on the screen, and I'm also waggling the paperback version. If you haven't had a look at this, really recommend it. Just as I recommend having a look at Katya's Twitter feed. She tweets at @Hoyer_Kat. Really great for lots of extra little bits of information, things happening on this particular day. And as a teacher, there's often little bits that I can steal for my lessons. So I really recommend that you have a look at that as well. Without further ado, I'll pass over to Katya for her talk this evening about Kaiser Wilhelm II. Thank you, Katya.
Oh, thank you for your lovely introduction. Yeah, maybe I'll start quickly just to frame this talk and what I'm actually trying to do with this. So the idea really of the book that I wrote was to try and basically take the Second Reich seriously and examine it and discuss it on its own terms, as opposed to a prelude to what came after. And in the course of that, obviously, several interesting characters emerged, and one of them is Wilhelm II. And I think the same principle applies to him as well. So people have often seen him as a sort of proto-dictator in many ways, somebody who led Germany into the catastrophe of the First World War, and should therefore be seen kind of in one line with what happened after. But I do think Wilhelm also should be seen kind of as a man of his time, and that's what I'm trying to do in this talk. So hopefully this will put the last German emperor into his kind of context of the time, but also in terms of just trying to understand the kind of type of person that he was, why he made certain decisions, as far as we can fathom that with him. So it's a bit tricky, as you'll hopefully see in the course of this talk. So that's why I've chosen this as a subject for this talk, because I think he is an interesting character that often gets sort of caricatured or almost kind of seen as a sort of cartoon villain. So it's very worth, I think, having a look at Wilhelm and his persona in his own right, given the importance of his political decision making. So hopefully my screen's changed. If anything goes wrong with my PowerPoint, you'll have to tell me. So this is how Wilhelm is often seen and portrayed, as this sort of Prussian warlord who enjoyed all things military, was very much obsessed with his uniforms, with building up the German military, and it's sort of often used as a means of expressing that, Germany was kind of almost inevitably moving towards the First World War under his leadership. And this is also partially how he wanted to be seen himself. So, this is obviously a portrait that Wilhelm had commissioned, and you can see here that, this isn't just us interpreting that afterwards, but also Wilhelm kind of seeing himself in that way. But apart from this kind of persona that he's trying to project and that many people saw him in him afterwards, there's also an actual person, a kind of man behind this image. And that's also what I'm trying to get at in this talk today. So this, for example, here is an image of Wilhelm with his grandsons on the Hohenzollern yacht, and also with one of his dachshunds. He was obsessed with them and had several in succession. And here you can see, I mean, if you look at his face, for example, and the faces of his grandsons, you can see that there's a human component to Wilhelm as well, in both a positive and a problematic way, as we'll discover. But I think it's important with somebody who is a hereditary monarch and wasn't elected, of course, that the power that he has within the state, that we also look at his own personality to try and fathom why he made certain decisions and didn't make others. So I'll try and sort of cover both his personal life and his political life, and bring the two together whenever I think there are some kind of links between the two that are worth identifying and discussing. He's also an important figure, or has become more of an important figure, I would say, recently, because of several debates that have emerged within kind of German modern politics. So that here is Georg Friedrich, who's on the left, who is the current head of the Hohenzollern dynasty. He is Kaiser Wilhelm's great grandson. And I think has in some ways an uncanny likeness there. I mean, I've chosen obviously the two pictures here deliberately, but in many ways he does astonishingly look like him. They've got very strong genes there, the Hohenzollerns, I think. But the point I'm trying to make here is because of his, so Georg Friedrich's current kind of quest to get some of the Hohenzollern estate back that was taken away from the family after the Second World War. A debate has once again ensued around kind of what role the Hohenzollern family played in the emergence of the Nazis after the First World War and into the early 1930s. Because as the law stands, basically you can only reclaim land that was taken away from you after the Second World War if you can sort of prove that your family was not involved in helping the Nazis into power. And out of that has basically now come an entire research field once again around the Hohenzollern family, and particularly their role in the emergence of Nazism. So there's also a very current sort of component to studying Wilhelm and the entire Hohenzollern family as well. So just to frame this talk a little bit in that way. So let's maybe start at the beginning with little Wilhelm. This is how it all began, basically. So Wilhelm was born on the 27th of January, 1859. And these pictures that you can see here are basically of him as a toddler in the early 1860s. And I think some of the things that I just wanted to highlight here is how his role is already sort of carved out for him at this point. So it's obvious that one day he will become King of Prussia. Maybe again worth pointing out as well that Germany doesn't exist at this point. So he is a member of the Prussian royal family, and is therefore expected basically to become the King of Prussia at some point. And he's already therefore cast in various different roles. So in the middle and on the right, you can see him in this sort of dress-like outfit, which may seem a little bit sort of girly to our eyes now, but the idea was basically to portray the children of nobility as sort of angelic, pure creatures when they're born, when they're little. So they're basically dressed up as sort of little angel-like figures, and quite often you see them painted with sort of very rosy cheeks and highlighted in the same way that you would sort of expect depictions of angels in churches, for example, to look like. And so there's that element, this kind of divine right of kings component, the idea that there's a sort of divine element in their person already right from the beginning. But then you can also see him on the left there, in a sort of sailor's outfit. And that also from the very beginning is part of Wilhelm's upbringing as a sort of military component as well. And I also quite like sort of the look he's got on his face there, the hands in the pockets. So there's already a certain sort of assertiveness there that comes with the sort of military side. So you've got a fragile, angelic side to it, as well as a sort of early preparation for military life as well, in the way that he's depicted as a little boy. I also just want to quickly line out Wilhelm's sort of family background, because I think he's very conscious of that once he's in power. And therefore it's kind of worth outlining that quickly. So the lady on the screen now is Queen Louise, who was Queen of Prussia during the Napoleonic Wars, and is often seen as somewhat of a sort of, I would say almost like a founding mother, if you will, figure for Germany, because she, during the Napoleonic Wars, basically was beginning to gather a war party to try and basically push her husband, the King of Prussia, into fighting Napoleon and pushing back the Napoleonic conquest, which he initially was reluctant to do. And out of that, she became somewhat of a kind of extremely revered figure in her own right. She was politically very astute, also, but by all accounts, and I think as you can see there on the picture as well, very sort of attractive, known for her beauty. It was famously she that negotiated with Napoleon about the peace terms with Prussia rather than her husband. And Napoleon called her the only man in Prussia, not only as an attempt to sort of as a slight towards her husband, emasculating him even further, but also because he genuinely, as many other people did, sort of respected her as a politician. in her own right. And she is Wilhelm's grandmother. So this is something worth bearing in mind, because the first ideas of sort of German nationhood and the idea of Germans being one people that begin to really solidify stem from this time period. So from the galvanization of the Prussian people and of the German people to some extent as well against Napoleon, and she is seen as somewhat of a figurehead. And it does also help, in inverted commas, that she died very young. She was only in her 30s in 1810, I think. She died, and therefore became even more of a martyr figure, because it was her death and the way that her husband, Friedrich Wilhelm, is so distraught about the whole thing, that he finally sort of galvanizes some a sort of momentum there behind the campaign against Napoleon, and begins to fight back. She's also the first recipient ever of the Iron Cross. It was actually founded as an honor kind of after her death, and it was given to her post-mortem for the effort to sort of fight back, really. So hence, Wilhelm is very conscious of that as her sort of descendant, if you will. And then her son, Wilhelm I, who you can also see on the picture, she's Wilhelm's great grandmother, I should have said. So basically, we're going now to Wilhelm's grandfather, Wilhelm I, who's Louise's son and Wilhelm's grandfather. Sorry about that earlier. So he becomes the first Kaiser of Germany once it's founded in 1871. And so there's a direct line really there of all of the history that happens across the 19th century. This kind of formation of Germany as a nation state happens under Wilhelm II's sort of predecessors, and leads up to sort of his realm, and he sees it almost as kind of taking over this legacy, and sees it as his responsibility to bring it to a fruition, and therefore is very conscious of his sort of national or nation building background there. Another part of the family to point out is Wilhelm's mother and father. So reason why I'm pointing this out just very briefly here is because Wilhelm's upbringing is very much determined by their relationship with him. So you've got Frederick III there with his English wife, Vicky, or Victoria, who's Queen Victoria's oldest daughter. And they are a very kind of politically very liberal couple, and have plans really for, once Wilhelm I is out of the way and dies, and the scepter sort of gets handed over to them, to reform Germany as a sort of more liberal system, in using England, or kind of the parliamentary or the constitutional monarchy that you have in England, as a model for running the country basically in Germany in a similar way. It did help that they sort of have a role model there in Queen Victoria in England, having run the country together with Prince Albert, who's German as well. So you have this kind of Anglo-German power dynamic going in England, and the two of them are sort of importing that, if you will, into Germany as well. So they're sort of sitting in the wings when Germany is founded in 1871, knowing that Wilhelm I is already quite old at this point. He was born in 1797, so really already quite old, and they're hoping that one day basically they'll be able to take over and reform Germany and modernize it as well. So just quickly on that relationship a little bit. So when Wilhelm grows up, he develops a pretty complicated relationship, particularly with his mother, but with both of his parents. There are various reasons for that. So one problem, for example, is that Frederick, his father, travels a lot. So he basically is away a lot of the time, and then eventually becomes ill and incapacitated, and therefore has a sort of fairly distant relationship with his son Wilhelm all the way through, really. But the more complicated, and I would say perhaps the more impactful relationship, is that with his mother Vicky, who was extremely young when she had Wilhelm. So Wilhelm was her first child, and she was only 18 when he was born. And the entire, you just imagine she'd just come to a foreign country, gets married at the age of 17, and then has her first son at 18, and the responsibility of basically raising the person who will one day be the king and later even the Kaiser basically of Germany, is immense. It's a huge responsibility on her shoulders, particularly the sort of physical characteristics of a child are still basically being blamed on the mother. Many of you will know this, but basically Wilhelm's birth was very complicated. He was in the breech position, and when he was born, the complications during the birth process led to a point where the doctor who was delivering Wilhelm sort of panicked somewhat and yanked him out of his mother's womb by his arm, and damaged some ligaments in the shoulder. And that meant that little Wilhelm wasn't really able to use the arm at all. It was basically paralyzed. It didn't really develop fully because the muscles and the tendons didn't develop, and he ended up with a disability for his entire life. Now, bearing in mind what I just said about the sort of physical dynamics of this hereditary monarchy and the way that basically the mother would have been held responsible for him, and Vicky herself saw it that way as well. She was trying to make this right, basically this defect that this boy that she wanted to be perfect had needed to be fixed in her eyes. And so basically she spent much of his younger years, when Wilhelm was younger, trying to physically basically fix him. So they tried various different things. He had to wear a sort of physical brace that would keep his body upright for a while. They tried cutting. So when his arm didn't develop properly, his head started leaning to one side. And so they tried cutting a tendon in his neck to try and straighten the neck back out. And as you can imagine, in the 19th century, that wasn't a particularly pleasant procedure. And she writes about this quite movingly and quite sort of in a very emotional way to her mother in England. And so we have a lot of the sort of evidence of that still in the letters that she writes, including sort of little drawings of Wilhelm as well. So Wilhelm sort of grows up with the idea that there's something not quite right about him, and that his mother sees it that way as well, and that makes their relationship quite difficult. It's sort of when you look at Wilhelm's own correspondence with his mother, particularly once he's off away at boarding school and sort of writes letters to her, you can really see that this is oscillating between resentment for the rejection that he feels and sort of anger and the need to prove himself, but on the flip side also an incredibly emotional, almost sort of semi-erotic way in which he sees his mother as well. So some of the letters really border on sort of quite dubious sentiments towards his mother as well. So just one example here. I'll just leave that up there for 1 minute for you to read. So what I find really interesting about that is not just obviously the almost sort of, it's almost like he's writing to a girlfriend or to a lover in the way that he describes her and the sort of words that he uses. But this is all about, hands and arms, and, I pulled your glove of your dear left hand, and he kisses her hand and he just wishes she would do the same. I mean, you don't have to be Freud to work out what's going on here, and how he just wants basically his disability to be accepted by her and to be recognized and to be almost loved basically in its own right. And this is just one example. So you get the sense really that their relationship is incredibly problematic. And this is something that is quite important, not least because Vicky is English as well, and some of that sentiment that he feels towards his mother he almost becomes kind of reflected again later in his relationship with England as a country as well. And as we're on the topic, so from the beginning, really, from when he's very young, Wilhelm has got an incredibly kind of close and very personal relationship to his relatives in England. So you can see him here. I think this is in the early 1860s. This is at Balmoral on the left with his father Frederick, which is obviously not too hard to guess given the garb that they're both wearing, but they do spend a lot of time there. And on the other side, you can see him there with Victoria at Osborne, where he spent a lot of time as well, and he sort of grows up with that as part of the backdrop to his childhood. Victoria, by all accounts, was very fond of him, found him a bit of a handful, but also sort of enjoyed his presence as well. I mean, he was her oldest grandchild, and would one day be the king of Prussia and later the Kaiser of Germany. So, you know, he was a source of pride to her, but also very difficult to handle too. But she did also have lots of sort of portraits around Osborne of him and of the sort of German side of the family. I think the location is important as well. So when you think where Osborne is on the Isle of Wight, this is quite important in the sense that, you know, you've basically got Portsmouth and Southampton right there, and so when Wilhelm stands on the roof of Osborne Palace, he can see the merchant fleet and the warships basically coming in and out of the Solent, and is absolutely fascinated with the scale and size of it. I mean, this is the height of the British Empire, and he's right kind of at the, you know, the visible center of that, being able to physically see kind of the extent of it almost by watching the fleet. And this is something that leaves quite a strong impression on him as well. And the entire culture that comes with that is something that he's keen to adopt, as you saw earlier, with this little sailor's uniform as well, complete with the knot. When Germany is founded in 1871 as a nation state, Wilhelm is still a child. He's 11 years old at this point. And he observes the ceremony, I would say, and the entire kind of national sentiment that is built around that, including the unification wars that led up to the actual unification of Germany, with a sort of childlike sense of awe and kind of the glory of it all, really leaves an impression on him, particularly the whole kind of military pomp around that, the idea that if Germany fights against another country, it sort of stands together and it stands behind one monarch, is really impressed on him. And it's important to remember that he witnesses those things as a young boy, bearing in mind what I said about his family background earlier as well. So there's a sense already that there's a legacy now. 1871 now appears as the natural kind of endpoint of this German unification process. And Wilhelm watches this as a child, kind of thinking, when I'm grown up and when I'm the king or the emperor, then I need to carry on with this legacy and take it kind of to its conclusion, and further the kind of course of German unity. And he also learns quite early on that this is part of that is the German military and the way that people fight together against somebody else, rallying behind the monarch in that way. So this leaves quite a strong impression of him as a child. Also worth saying that when Germany is founded, just to put a little bit of context around that, it becomes overnight the largest European nation state. It's huge. It dominates the center of Europe now. It's got by a long way the highest amount of people in it. It's massive, and that's a responsibility that Wilhelm's grandfather, Wilhelm I, isn't really 100% certain he wants. So he's not overly enthusiastic about the idea of Germany as his realm now. That's not to say that, you know, he's entirely averse to the idea of gaining more power, but the point is that he feared that Prussia would kind of dissolve itself in this new Germany, and he isn't entirely keen on that. So when Wilhelm takes over nearly 20 years later, and Wilhelm II, that is his grandson, he feels that he is the first kind of really German Kaiser of Germany, the first one who really wants this, who grew up as a German rather than a Prussian, and really wants to take this entire country forward, as opposed to kind of accepting it as a necessary means of keeping in power and allowing Prussia more power. So this is also something worth saying. And he sees Bismarck, in particular Otto von Bismarck, the first German chancellor, as somebody who sort of managed this new nation state on behalf of a king who didn't want it. So when Wilhelm takes over, in 1888, Wilhelm II, he sort of sees Bismarck almost as a superfluous figure because he's quite willing and happy to run the country by himself, as opposed to kind of running it in the same way that his grandfather had done. When in 1888, Wilhelm I, on the far left, finally dies. I say finally because you basically end up with him, I think, almost having lived too long. So the fact that he is there when the empire is founded in 1871 and still runs it in 1888, you know, as I said earlier, he was born in the previous century. He's really a relic of a long gone past. Means that there wasn't really kind of inspirational leadership to take Germany in a particular direction or take it forward. And as a result of that, Bismarck kind of just manages it in the way that he sees fit from his kind of very Prussian-centric perspective. So when he dies, his son, Frederick III, briefly takes over for 100 days in 1888, and there isn't really a chance for him to change the country. 100 days isn't long enough. He's already very ill at this point with throat cancer, so much so that he can't actually speak throughout his entire reign. So people already know that he's gravely ill. He's going to die very soon, and the court almost doesn't actually bother changing in outlook or in personnel, because they know that when Wilhelm II takes over, so Wilhelm I's grandson, the course of kind of fairly conservative politics is going to continue, because it's already relatively obvious what Wilhelm II's mindset is and what his relationship to his parents was. So those 100 days of rule between Frederick and Vicky doesn't really have a chance to take off. It's one of the sort of big what ifs in German history in terms of what could have and might have happened had they had more time, or had Wilhelm I died earlier, or had Frederick III not been ill. But all of that isn't what didn't happen, and so you end up with this kind of three Kaiser year, where in rapid succession you have Wilhelm I, Frederick III, and Wilhelm II taking over. Wilhelm II at this point isn't even 30 years old yet. He's 29 when he becomes the new Kaiser of Germany. And instantly this seems like a really fresh start to a lot of people, despite the fact that his politics are actually sort of quite similar to his grandfather's. He's also quite conservative in outlook, but this is literally now skipped a generation basically from Wilhelm I to Wilhelm II, and many people are quite excited initially about the sort of prospect of that. Oh, just briefly going back, one more thing I wanted to mention is that when Frederick III died and he's on his deathbed, Wilhelm II is still so obsessed with the idea that he isn't working with his parents, but they're kind of conspiring against him, that he has the palace surrounded with guards in case his mother, Vicky, plans some sort of coup to take over the country by herself, which is of course complete nonsense. But he's basically trying to make sure that they don't, because he'd become so paranoid at that point that they would sort of connive and change something about the succession, that he feels the need to have the palace surrounded even. Of course, nothing happens and he takes over. This picture I find quite interesting, because here you can see Wilhelm II with Bismarck. And initially they, as this picture also implies to some extent, had a fairly kind of good working relationship for a long time, because of the way that Wilhelm's father wasn't really around and he had a difficult relationship to him. Bismarck to some extent becomes a father figure to Wilhelm. He also ensures that his own son, so that's Bismarck's son, Herbert, befriends Wilhelm and becomes kind of a confidant to him. And a lot of the sort of political tutelage is done through Bismarck. And Bismarck imagines at this point in 1888, having run the country since 1871, that this is going to continue. So this kind of mentor-student relationship is just going to continue. Wilhelm will sort of learn the ropes from him, and he will continue to run the country. But they pretty soon clash over lots of things, mostly at this point to do with socialism and the idea that Bismarck wants to crack down on it, having seen kind of strike action and other political turmoil that he deems dangerous to the Reich. Basically, Bismarck decided to really crack down on these things and sent out soldiers to sort of, you know, crush uprisings and strike action and so on. Whilst Wilhelm, when he takes over, initially has this kind of idealist dream that he will be the Kaiser of the rabble, as he puts it. And that he will kind of lead all Germans, and he doesn't want to start his reign by cracking down on socialist uprisings and on the workers. So they already from a very early age, or from a very early stage in this kind of power dynamics between the two, that begins to break, and it doesn't last very long at all. So in 1890, Bismarck is forced to resign because the relationship between him and Wilhelm sort of breaks down completely, and he goes. I find this cartoon quite interesting. I mean, there's obviously the more famous one, which many of you may know, the Dropping the Pilot cartoon that was in the Punch, where sort of Bismarck walks off the ship as Wilhelm looks over the top of it and sort of you know, thinks about where he's going to sail with the ship next, now that the captain, the pilot, is dismissed. But I find this quite interesting as well. There's a lot to it here that I think is quite revealing about the concerns that were there once Bismarck goes. I mean, Bismarck seems to sort of grudgingly look back, you know, sort of drawing his hat as he walks away. And you know, there's Germany there in the background looking on rather anxiously, sort of literally biting her nails, wondering what's going to happen to her now. And then you see a rather childish looking Wilhelm with the crown that's too big for his head, holding a sort of baby made out of dynamite and bombs, you know, that's wrapped in a blanket that says socialism, whilst he's sitting on a throne made of weapons. So, you know, this idea that a volatile young Kaiser has now taken over, dismissed the person who basically ran the country successfully for nearly 2 decades at this point, worries people both in Germany and in Europe, and people aren't entirely sure at this point where this is going. However, I mean, this is where I want to complicate the narrative a little bit. So this idea that once Bismarck's gone, it's all lost, and Germany is moving towards kind of militarism and the First World War in a way that, you know, made the whole thing inevitable. There is also still the entire system that Bismarck had set up. So the constitution, as he wrote it, contained, I would say, at least 50% of it was fairly democratic. So you do have a sort of bicameral structure whereby you've got an upper and a lower house, and the lower house, the Reichstag, is basically an elected parliament that is elected by universal male suffrage, all men over the age of 25, which is fairly democratic for the time. And I think when you look at the Reichstag building, which was finished in 1894, so just 4 years after Wilhelm took over completely, 4 years after he dismissed Bismarck, I think you can see just how confident and how powerful Parliament at this point had become. This isn't just a fake leaf of democracy, as Wilhelm Liebknecht, one of the SPD founders, one of the social democratic founders, put it. But this is actually, I think, a statement that just shows just how powerful democracy had become at this point as well, and that's something that Wilhelm has to contend with. I find it quite interesting that once the building is complete, Wilhelm absolutely hates it. He famously calls it an ape house, which is partially to do with the fact that the actual ape house in Berlin Zoo had also just been finished, or was just being finished, and it also had like a sort of crystal glass dome at the top, under which the monkeys were sort of squabbling, and that's kind of where he takes the comparison from. But you can see through the language, you know, if a monarch used that sort of language today, they'd be gone. But you can see just how much resentment there is, and how dismissive he still is about Parliament, despite the fact that Parliament understands itself now as part of the kind of lawmaking process, to a point where it can't be excluded from it. And thereby this conflict between what Wilhelm wants and what the parliamentarians want escalates quite quickly. But I think it's worth pointing out that if Parliament hadn't played along with 1914, and in the build up to that, Wilhelm couldn't have built up the naval and sort of land powers that he built up. He couldn't have militarized in the same way. He couldn't have extended and built up Germany's overseas empire in the same way, and he certainly couldn't have gone to war in 1914 because Parliament held the purse strings. Effectively, they were responsible for the budget. So that's worth pointing out that Wilhelm is not an absolute monarch. He gets to decide everything that happens. His main power, as Christopher Clark, for instance, has pointed out in his book, I'll talk a bit more about that later as well. But he's right in saying that basically the main thing that Wilhelm has got going for himself is that he can appoint and dismiss the Chancellor and the other government ministers. So those political appointments are powerful because thereby he sort of controls the executive. But he can't control who sits in Parliament, and he certainly can't control what is said there. It's quite remarkable as well that you've got sort of freedom of speech and expression within Parliament, that can't be limited in any shape or form. And so he's basically powerless in terms of the debates that are going on in there and the decisions that are made in Parliament as well. Socialism, I already mentioned, was a problem that Bismarck had already grappled with, and is something that once Bismarck goes and his repressive measures go, Wilhelm has got to grapple with that even more. So you basically end up with a sort of very buoyant social democratic / socialist movement, all of that combined in one political party within the Social Democratic Party. That is growing very rapidly now since sort of Bismarck's gone, and there's also another wave of industrialization which pushes even more workers into the cities where they're kind of together and organized and become increasingly politicized. Something else that's worth pointing out, is often forgotten, is that Germany's education system is excellent at this point. It had already been sort of really furthered under Bismarck and continues to grow and expand. So you've got compulsory primary education, for example. And so Germany ends up with the highest literacy rate in the world at this point, which in turn means that even if you are a factory worker or a farmhand or a sort of manual laborer, you can now read and write and therefore be taught things and learn things as you will. And there's very little control over that because the press is actually comparatively free at this point. And so workers become incredibly politicized. They sort of all get crammed in together in tenement housings and factories in the cities, where they listen to lectures, where factories have installed libraries. Literature like, for instance, the Communist Manifesto is out there. So all of that's happening, and it becomes incredibly difficult to control for Wilhelm. By 1912, so 2 years before the First World War breaks out, the SPD becomes the largest political party in the Reichstag, and thereby is something that Wilhelm constantly has to deal with and becomes incredibly frustrated with, which is worth bearing in mind for when we look at 1914 in a minute. Wilhelm, meanwhile, hasn't lost his sort of penchant for all things military. So I just put a random collection of sort of Wilhelm's favorite uniforms out there. I find the middle one particularly striking. You can see him there once again on the roof of Osborne in a British uniform, naval uniform. And I find that quite, remarkable that he's very, very pleased to have these different roles. Wears the different uniforms with pride, including his English uniforms, and sort of retains that fascination with the military. Because if you remember that he was a child the last time he experienced war, and those were the unification wars of the 1860s and 1870 against France, you end up with a very kind of childlike way of imagining what war is like. To Wilhelm, this is all about heroism, about strategy, about winning glorious victories, because he'd never seen anything else as a child. He didn't have like bombs raining down on his head. He didn't have millions of people, of his country dying in trenches. There wasn't poison gas. There weren't all of these things. There weren't machine guns. So when he was a child, war was still a short, in his view, glorious thing that gave you victories and that gave you a chance to make your country better and sort of bring the people behind you. And that is something that accompanies kind of his political views as well. in terms of Germany's overseas empire, this is also something that has recently entered public debate a lot again. So as the sort of debate around colonialism has really taken hold in the US and in Britain in particular, some of that has also now reached Germany, where for a long time the sole focus really was on the Second World War and the crimes that came with that, in particular, of course, the Holocaust. But people are now also looking further back and looking at this, at the overseas empire. So it's just worth highlighting Wilhelm's role in that briefly. So when the first colonies were acquired by Germany, it was under Bismarck still. Bismarck had been quite reluctant, very reluctant to build up an empire for himself, not out of moral reasons, but because he deemed it a dangerous thing to have. When you've got a situation where Germany is still a relatively new country in Europe and has got colonial powers that it needs to sort of appease and prove to that it can be a peaceful player in Europe. The way that Bismarck saw it, the world was pretty much carved up already, and there was no point kind of aggravating Britain and France and also Belgium and the Dutch and so on and so forth over the sort of scraps of land that were still left. But that's not how German industrialists saw it. And so many of them sort of go off and start their own projects overseas and start buying land in Africa, for example, where they then, funnily enough, aren't particularly welcomed by the local population and end up being attacked and in trouble all the time, calling in turn on the German government to protect them. And it's at that point, when this is beginning to escalate, that Bismarck places some territories under German protection, and they're called protectorates to start with. When Wilhelm takes over, all of that kind of initial reluctance and caution gets blown out of the window, simply because Wilhelm himself is obsessed with the idea that in order to become a world power, kind of a world leading power, he must have an empire for Germany. Remember kind of what I was trying to get at earlier with the legacy thing. So with him looking to Louise and to his grandfather Wilhelm, the idea that kind of Germany was an idea and then started and then was formed, Wilhelm thinks he needs to take it to the next level. The next kind of part of this process must be to, now that Germany is a European power, to take it to a world power. And this so-called Weltpolitik is what drives a lot of Wilhelm's policies internally and externally. And so more colonies are acquired under Wilhelm's reign. His chancellors are perfectly happy to do that, particularly Bülow, his second chancellor, who famously says that Germany deserves a place in the sun as well, and tells the Reichstag so, because many people in the Reichstag aren't overly pleased with that, particularly the Social Democrats. And therefore you end up with not the largest empire, of course, in the world, but it's worth saying that it ends up being the third largest after Britain and France. So it's not a small empire. It just isn't economically viable in the way that Britain's and France's empires are. So actually Germany does more trade with the British Empire than it does with its own colonies. So they're never economically viable. They're always kind of an ideological project. In terms of Wilhelm's own sort of doings during this time, initially people really like him. It's also worth saying, because it's easy to forget now after the calamity of the First World War and what happened later. But when he came in, a man in his 20s, in his late 20s, and takes over from, this relic of the past, he seems to fit in with the zeitgeist really well. So the fact that Germany is moving so quickly and is developing so quickly, economically as well as sort of socially, seems to sort of demand a young Kaiser. And Wilhelm, in many ways, represents the zeitgeist in his own sort of interests. So he's incredibly, almost childlike in his enthusiasm for new technology. The first cars, for example, something that really interests Wilhelm. Lots of scientific institutes are founded during that time. Wilhelm goes to lots of factory openings, when new ships are launched, he's there and sees them off. So, you know, he seems to be everywhere. He travels a lot, and looks at all of kind of these new things that are happening in Germany with the same kind of enthusiasm and kind of glee that many of his countrymen do. And so to start with, he's actually quite popular. What tends to damage, or when it starts to, what starts to sort of damage that reputation is really when in the early years of the new century, several political and certain kind of affairs and crises happen that tarnish his reputation. And the biggest one, I just want to take a few minutes to talk about here, is his friendship with a man called Philip zu Eulenburg. So when you remember that Wilhelm's father is dead, his grandfather is dead, Bismarck at this point is also dead, but he'd already dismissed him years earlier, it doesn't leave very many kind of potential sort of mentors or people to take advice from. And when he sort of befriends Philip zu Eulenburg, who's a lot older than him and very charming and very sort of easily able to influence the Kaiser, he very quickly takes to him, and the two become fast friends. And Wilhelm ends up spending a lot of time at Eulenburg's estate, the Liebenberg estate. So sometimes this whole group of people that met there are also known as the Liebenberg Circle. This is problematic for several reasons, not least because this group of people that meet there, Bülow is one of them as well, ends up being incredibly influential. They basically choose the chancellors, they choose the policies, and they basically tell Wilhelm more or less what to do. And his relationship to Philip, to Eulenburg in particular, is incredibly emotional. So Eulenburg is into poetry and into writing music, and he actually dedicates some of his art to the Kaiser. So he's sort of sat there singing songs to the Kaiser, and then the Kaiser goes away, you know, making Weltpolitik. So this is something that a lot of people see very critical, particularly journalists. And so one journalist in particular, Maximilian von Harden, decides to break this all up and basically put a bit of a wedge between this group of influencers and Wilhelm, and decides to spread rumors in the press that Eulenburg is a homosexual, which was of course still illegal at the time. And on top of that, you know, people already have kind of ideas in their head as to what happens when a bunch of men sort of spends time on a meadow on an estate in the countryside reading romantic poetry to one another. And so this becomes really quite a big issue, because Eulenburg decides to fight this in court, and basically takes Harden to court for libel. And so therefore this entire process doesn't kind of just blow up in the news and then vanishes again, but it stays in people's consciousness for years, because these court processes kind of take a long time. And eventually it got to a point, pretty quickly it gets to a point where Wilhelm has got to distance himself from Eulenburg and from this entire group of advisors, so that he doesn't get sucked into the same sort of maelstrom of scandal. This then, however, means that, you know, take him out of that group, and you still have a very naive, very insecure, and very directionless Kaiser. So he turns elsewhere for advice, and there aren't very many people that he can turn to. So when he returns to court, who's there is effectively the military advisors. It's people like Moltke and Schlieffen and other sort of you know, Prussian aristocrats in the military circles, who play into Wilhelm's natural affinity with the military, and you know, sort of take him into their fold and influence him from then onwards. So this really isn't helpful when all of that escalates in 1907, 1908, and 1909. On top of that, there's the infamous, I should say, Daily Telegraph affair, whereby basically, just to sum this up very briefly, I talk about this in the book as well. But basically, Wilhelm goes and speaks to a British army officer, a friend of his, in Britain at Highcliffe Castle, I think in Dorset, and they basically sit by the fireside and have a chat over a glass of whiskey, and then they talk about politics and about the escalating tensions between Britain Germany. And Wilhelm sort of sits there and says to his friend that he feels that there is no need for there to be any tension between Britain and Germany. He himself is kind of the cornerstone between those two nations. He's he's a descendant of both of them. He doesn't understand why there's so much anti-British sentiment in Germany, and so on and so forth. This idea emerges, well, maybe that would be helpful if everyone knew that, so why don't we take it to the press? And the kind of notes of that conversation get sent to the Daily Telegraph as an interview transcript. So initially, the idea is normally that these kind of transcript notes get checked by politicians. So they do actually get sent to Germany to be checked. Chancellor doesn't have time, passes it basically down to his own lackeys. They don't really want to change anything. I mean, ultimately, these are the Kaiser's words, and if you're some sort of clerk somewhere down the line, you're not going to sit there and censor or kind of alter the words of the Kaiser. And so they basically just get sent back unaltered, and the Daily Telegraph prints them as they are. So here's kind of a somewhat drunken fireside conversation suddenly, in the British press. Wilhelm kind of said very insensitive things, like most famously, this what's on the screen there: "You English are mad, mad, mad as March hares. What has come over you that you are so completely given over to suspicions quite unworthy of a great nation?" So this is not exactly the stuff out of a diplomacy textbook. He also manages to insult various other people, including most Germans, because he basically claims that they're all anti-British in outlook, and various, including the Japanese, various other nations as well, just within that one interview. So that explodes because basically, Parliament, the Reichstag, sort of sit there and say, well, hang on a minute, who do you think you are speaking for all Germans in the way that you do? We're here too. We are the people's representatives. This is incredibly dangerous as well at a time where tensions are really high. Bülow gets dismissed over that, as people sort of feel that somebody has to take the blame and it can't be the Kaiser. And Wilhelm is forced to sort of keep his head down. And this is quite a dangerous situation because we're now, sort of going into the 1910s, and you have a Kaiser who can't really have a public profile for a few years, and sort of has to say yes to everything that comes from elsewhere. So this is just worth bearing in mind that Wilhelm is very much tarnished by these things. And when the crisis does escalate, or international crises escalate from sort of 1912 onwards, he's very much ready to embrace those in order to get himself out of this hole again and become, kind of overshadow basically his internal problems with foreign policy. So skipping forward then to 1914, when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated on the 28th of June in 1914, Wilhelm is hosting a tea party. Or when that happened, basically when the telegram came through telling him the news, he was just on his yacht hosting a tea party there with various different families. And the tea party is instantly interrupted. The telegram is read out that the Archduke has been assassinated, and there's instantly a sense of this is big, something big is going to happen here. Wilhelm is personally very shocked by this, because he was effectively very friendly with Franz Ferdinand, and they went hunting together a lot, and so he feels this is an attack, or was an attack on a personal friend of his, as well as on kind of monarchical rule in Europe. So he takes this very badly. However, he is convinced very quickly by his politicians that this can be managed. It's not something that has to lead to a sort of major war. But it might lead to a sort of localized war in the Balkans over all of this. If push comes to shove, basically, both Wilhelm and many of his advisors take the view that Austria, whose heir to the throne this was, needs to be supported and defended by its ally Germany. And if that involves kind of war in the Balkans, then so be it. They even at this point accept that if they're fighting a war in the Balkans, this might draw the Russians in. Wilhelm, sort of dismisses the idea of Russia being a dangerous country now that needs to be sort of appeased and thinks, right, fine, if Russia is going to eventually be an enemy, I'd rather it was an enemy now before it sort of industrializes properly and becomes more dangerous than it currently is. So he's sort of reassured by the idea that people are managing the situation for him, and even if it escalates into a war, it will be something that Germany can come out of well. And it might also just be the thing that can get him out of his domestic troubles as well. On top of that, as I said earlier, the Social Democratic Party had become the largest party in 1912. The Liberals are pretty strong as well, and together the sort of progressive parties fill up roughly half the parliamentary seats, and the Conservatives the other half. And that leads to a standstill pretty much of politics in those last 2 years before the First World War. And this is something that is incredibly frustrating for Wilhelm to deal with, because effectively it means that every time he wants to expand, say, the navy, or wants to do something with the colonial empire, or just any reforms, really, anything that he wants to change, he has to go and negotiate, not personally, but through his chancellors, with Parliament. And so, this is another, going back here again to the 19th century and his upbringing, this is something that he's seen before, whereby Germans can be galvanized behind one purpose if they're fighting somewhere, if they're fighting someone. And so this here also seems a chance that if it does come to war, then so be it. Then at least it can help him sort of get over his domestic troubles. And therefore, it's quite telling, I always find, sort of thinking about it, that in the middle of this crisis, so Franz Ferdinand was shot at the end of June 1914. War breaks out at the beginning of August. So you have the whole July, basically, the so-called July crisis unfolding. And Wilhelm is just not there in that time. He goes on holiday. He did that every year, basically. He went on his Hohenzollern yacht, and you can see him there on the left, on his yacht, going off there with his Dachshunds on holiday. And he's just not there. All of that is being handled by other people. And the fact that he goes away, initially a bit kind of unsure about this, but he just sort of asks his advisors, can he still go on this cruise? And they go, yeah, sure, why not? And he goes off. So this idea that something as big as the First World War will come out of that is simply not there in Wilhelm's mind at this point. That's not to take him off the hook. I mean, he is the head of the military, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and therefore, of course, he is ultimately the person responsible for what the military does. But at the same time, it's clear from his behavior and from the way that he responds to the unfolding crisis that he did not see a kind of world war ensuing from that. So just very quickly to sum up the sort of role that he has in the First World War, he does indeed try and sort of galvanize Germans behind him, and basically tells them that he knows no more political parties, only Germans, in 1914. And this works initially. The so-called fortress peace, Burgfriede, that he introduces, means that even the SPD signs up to war credits, and Wilhelm can go to war. So this does take parliamentary consent. Parliament also signed an enabling act at this point in August, which basically hands all the power over to the executive for the war years. And this again is worth pointing out. This isn't Wilhelm getting rid of democracy. This is democracy abolishing itself during the war. When the Schlieffen Plan, which had involved sort of knocking out France quickly and then turning to Russia, fails literally right at the beginning, and Germany gets bogged down in France in September, and the stalemate ensues that leads to this horrific trench warfare during the First World War, to the stalemate that we see on the Western Front. It also means that war kind of very quickly turns into something that Wilhelm hadn't anticipated. This is very different from the wars that he had known as a child. This isn't over in a few months. It isn't a war of movement. It isn't a war of gaining territory and sort of defeating the enemy quickly, but actually it's a war of attrition that requires huge amounts of resources. And when that then quickly turns into a situation where from 1916 onwards, Germans experience real hardship, then the initial support that Wilhelm had in 1914 sort of drains away, and people very quickly want peace more than they want to support the war effort. And eventually, from 1917-18 onwards, they turn against Wilhelm himself. And towards the end of the war, the so-called German Revolution effectively then leads to a situation that was completely unforeseen in 1914, namely that the people would turn against their Kaiser, and Wilhelm has to abdicate, and his son, the Crown Prince Wilhelm, also has to promise that he will not sort of come back and get involved in politics again. And the two go into exile, and Wilhelm will stay the rest of his life at Housdoorn in the Netherlands, where he also died. So I'm aware I'm running quite late now. I'm just going to sum up, if this all seems a bit rushed now, I'm just going to sum up the kind of remaining years. Once Wilhelm has abdicated as Kaiser, that position in the new constitution, which obviously gets rewritten and there's other stuff that changes, but one of the key changes is that there's no more monarch, and instead a president sort of takes over the role of the commander-in-chief of the armed forces and of the head of state, and that's Friedrich Ebert to start with. And so therefore you have no longer a hereditary monarchy in Germany, but an elected president who during the Weimar Republic is directly elected by the people. Wilhelm, meanwhile, in exile, kind of goes back to his affinity with Britain, and dresses sort of up in the style of an English country gentleman, and hosts like tea parties and things, and kind of just pretends that he still has a court that people can come to. I can just very quickly maybe show some images of that. This is Wilhelm in exile, if I can play that.
You are looking at the house on the 2nd of Germany for 11 of the 13 years since his abdicated stroll through his private park with one of his household. We see that the former German ruler, who is now 72, has changed in appearance from the military warlord whom we so often saw in the war cartoons to a peaceful-looking country squire.
Hasn't he just? Yeah, so you see him a lot, sort of just like feeding ducks and hosting tea parties and things. His wife, however, so this is his second wife, his first wife, Augusta, dies in 1921, I think. And he basically marries again, and his second wife is much, much more ambitious. So this is Hermine Reuss von Greitz, or of Greitz. She actually writes a sort of a set of memoirs as well during this time, and she really wants to restore the monarchy. So she's only in her 30s at this point, sort of marries Wilhelm, and of course the suspicions are there, and probably quite rightly, that this is in the idea that the monarchy gets restored, and flirts quite a bit sort of with Nazism in Germany as well as a result of that. Wilhelm's own relationship to Nazism, so just to sum up that quickly, once Hitler comes into power, is hugely ambivalent. So you see kind of quotes like these. So this is after the Night of the Long Knives, when Hitler deals with his enemies on the conservative right. He says things like, "We have ceased to live under the rule of law, and everyone must be prepared for the possibility that the Nazis will push their way in and put them up against the wall." He calls them gangsters and so on and so forth. But on the flip side, if I just move forward a bit, he also congratulates Hitler once he manages to march into the Netherlands, where he still is at this point, and then into France. In particular, this kind of congratulatory letter once the invasion of France is successful is quite telling. But on the flip side, you also constantly get these descriptions of kind of Nazism as a fever, as a frenzy, as gangsterism. He actually said after the Nuremberg laws that he was ashamed to be German, only then to become anti-Semitic again from 1940 onwards. So it's incredibly difficult to really grasp from one moment to the next what Wilhelm made of it all, because it changed so frequently, as in particular in the last few years, when he sort of became incredibly volatile. And then from 1940 onwards, he really completely becomes senile and sort of loses the plot. It becomes very, very anti-Semitic, talks about sort of blood and the fight that's on people's hands, on Germans' hands, and so on and so forth. Becomes increasingly hard to sort of pin down on any political views, because he does just become senile. He continues with his hobby, chopping wood, until the very end, until he's, I can't remember if it was a heart attack or a stroke that he suffered during his kind of wood chopping activities, and that's effectively what he died of on the 4th of June 1941. He's still buried there now, and famously said that he doesn't want his body taken back to Germany until the monarchy is restored, and that's been honored to this day. Okay, and I'll leave that here, I think.
Thank you so much for that, Katya. Really, really interesting talk. If it's all right with you, we've got about 20 minutes left, so I'd just like to open the floor to ask if anybody has any questions. If you want to put up your digital hand or pop something in the chat, either would be fine. Perhaps while everybody's thinking of questions, Katya, I might ask you a little bit more about what people think in Germany at the present time about the monarchy. So you mentioned the great-grandson of Wilhelm. What do people think in Germany? Are people interested in kind of restoring the monarchy, or are people sort of quite willing to just let them quibble over land and leave it at that?
It's an interesting one. I just wrote a Spectator article on that as well, because it has become a point of discussion again. I mean, monarchism isn't really a huge thing in Germany. It tends to sort of be at 10% the support for that through the years, and there aren't any kind of very recent polls on this. But there has now emerged a sort of movement called the Reichsbürger, who are quite small but extreme, or some of the elements of them are quite extreme in their sort of idea that the German Empire was never abolished. So this abdication of the monarchy that I described earlier happened obviously under duress, if you will. So, you know, it's kind of partially enforced by President Wilson in the US, who made this a prerequisite for peace, and the German Revolution coming through in Germany itself. And so the Reichsbürgers basically argue that was never legitimate, and therefore the German Empire, the Second Reich, still exists, and they want to restore the monarchy, looking to Georg Friedrich there as a sort of figurehead of that. But that is a very small, at this point, still movement, if incredibly, it's at the moment, it's being watched basically by the German security forces as a potential source of danger. And a few weeks ago, a sort of small group was sort of uncovered and arrested under terrorism charges that sort of belong to this movement. But there isn't a widespread kind of demand for the Kaiser to come back. And as for the restoration of his property, I think that's a bit more of an open discussion. But people are still incredibly concerned about what would actually happen to all of the estates, to the artwork, and to everything else. Will people still have access to them? Because many of those are now museums or kind of openly accessible, and that's a concern that people have.
Thank you. I think Barry has his hand up with a question. Do you want to unmute Barry and ask yourself?
Thanks, Annabelle. Yes, a great talk, Katya. I was just interested in his relationship with Nazism. It sounds like he sort of prevaricated about it a little, and then was it seen as more opportunistic that, you know, they'd gained power and they looked like they were succeeding, therefore he sort of got involved. He doesn't seem to have a very sort of strong moral compass with this, or a strong sort of position with it. Is that true to say?
Yeah, I think that probably sums it up. I mean, this is exactly the problem that kind of various historians are trying to work out, because legally that is what it hinges on. Like, did they actually help the Nazis into power or not? You know, their current claims. I mean, it's interesting that his son, the Crown Prince Wilhelm, gets involved with the Nazis in Germany and is sort of trying to help them into power as far as he can, under the kind of almost condition that they would then restore the monarchy. But it becomes very quickly obvious that, first of all, the Nazis have no intention of installing the monarchy or reinstating it. And secondly, that, you know, Hitler is quite dismissive about the Hohenzollerns and the entire idea of bringing the monarchy back, for ideological reasons as well as kind of more generally. And, you know, the kind of cultural clashes between the two, you know, kind of the Kaiser, who thinks he's got every right to be the Kaiser of the Germans, kind of, you know, from his divine right of king's perspective, and Hitler, who says, well, you know, why should I bring you back? I've just become incredibly popular in Germany, taken over the country. They don't need them. and they want to install a sort of meritocratic system, whereby obviously the old kind of elites need to be at best held at bay, at worst kind of tolerated, and that's, I think, becomes obvious, and they become disillusioned with Nazism as a means of getting the monarchy reinstated. And I think that's what it sort of hinges on. I think they were never, certainly Wilhelm, I think, never really kind of genuinely enthralled with Nazism, other than it being a possible means of reinstating the monarchy back. And I think the other thing with Wilhelm is that he never got over the idea that he lost the First World War. And so when, Hitler conquers France, he sees it as a kind of a reversal of history for Germany, and doesn't really care what the ideology is that comes with that. It kind of makes up for his past failings. It's interesting that Britain actually offers him exile, so he could have gone, when Hitler invaded the Netherlands, he could have gone and lived in Britain as a lot of other European royalty did, and decided not to. And that in itself, I think, is quite interesting. So he certainly didn't see them as a threat, I don't think. Anti-Semitism is an interesting component there, because again, he fluctuates so much between this idea that the Nuremberg laws are appalling initially, and then actually being quite anti-Semitic himself. So that is really difficult to grasp really what his opinion is there.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions in the chat and a few people with their hands up. And perhaps if we could go to James McNeil, who wants to ask a question.
Although Bismarck died quite soon after getting chopped by Wilhelm, do you think if Bismarck had hung around a bit longer, he might have moderated some of Wilhelm's crazier sort of foreign policy gaffes? When, for example, when he had a treaty with the Tsar, which they got both parliaments repudiated. He wrote some outrageous letter to the United Kingdom, which I think was Bülow lost a plot about because it was just so outrageous. Do you think if Bismarck had been around a wee bit longer, that Wilhelm might have been a bit smarter in the foreign policy field?
I mean, the relationship between the two had just broken down to a point where, you sort of need to imagine Bismarck sitting there in his estate, writing angry newspaper articles and letters and things, and just becoming a cynical old man who sees his own life work disintegrate. So I'm not sure they could have had a constructive relationship in the way that was enough to sort of sway any of Wilhelm's policies and attitudes. I mean, Bismarck only died in 1898, so there is another 8 years there in theory where he could have had any kind of influence. But I think, Bismarck just becomes angry and disillusioned, and like I say, just increasingly kind of ranty in his writings. And on top of that, you have Wilhelm, who isn't willing to listen to him because he sees it as kind of this new Germany that's emerging. So I don't think there was a chance really for Bismarck to have enough political influence to change the course of what happened.
And perhaps if we could go to a question in the chat now. Michael Barker is asking, so is it your view that Wilhelm was not really responsible for the World War beginning, even though once at war he was quite bellicose?
I think he is responsible in the sense that, as I said earlier, his constitutional position almost dictates that he is responsible. I mean, he's in charge of the military, he's the head of the state. If he hadn't declared war wouldn't have been declared. So it's as easy as that. If he was completely adamant that nothing should happen there, then that would have certainly posed a problem, let's put it like that. I'm not saying that nothing would have happened because European tensions were there. But on the flip side, I just do not believe that he had the political acumen and the intelligence, frankly, and the kind of patience to sit there and work out this European puzzle, which had become so complicated at this point. Imagine, a sort of political figure. I mean, we have a few of those around now who just haven't got the attention to detail, the sort of patience to sit down and talk to different people about what the consequences of one's actions might be. And you have Wilhelm in a nutshell. I mean, he was just impulsive. He wanted things done quickly, and he wasn't somebody who thought things through. So I think there's another argument there that he didn't see what was happening, but that doesn't take the responsibility off him. if that makes sense. I do not think that he wanted a major European war, but I don't think that makes him not responsible for the fact that one eventually happened. He's certainly part of that, and a significant part of that sort of perfect storm that enveloped Europe in 1914.
I think that kind of links quite nicely to another question in the chat from Oliver Mason, who says, would you say he was well educated? He doesn't seem to have been very intellectual.
Yeah, I think that probably sums it up. I mean, it would be wrong to say that he was stupid. I don't think he was. I mean, he was well educated, certainly, from his position alone, but he read a lot as well. Like one of the examples that I haven't really gone into earlier was a book by an American naval captain called Alfred Thayer Mahan, which sort of claimed that in order to be a world power and a kind of powerful country, you needed to have sea power to further your kind of ambitions worldwide. And he, for instance, read that with gusto and was really enthused by that and discussed it a lot, had it translated. That doesn't make him an intellectual as such, but it does mean that he engages with kind of ideas and theories that are out there. He's really interested in Darwinism as a kind of way of seeing the world and imposes that onto nation states, for example. So whether that makes him intelligent or not is a different question, but it certainly means that he is aware of ideas that are being bandied around and tries to incorporate them into his own sort of worldview. But this impulsive thing doesn't help. So once he's kind of honed in on something and then thinks that that's the right thing to do, he'll go on and do it, only to then change his mind again, when he feels, oh, it's not going quite well, or somebody else tells him something else. He was incredibly impressionable as well, and lots of people were able to sort of change his mind very, very quickly.
Perhaps now we could go to Jason Millard, who has the hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't know whether it's a question or a comment or just a ponder, Katya, so forgive me. I guess I was just sort of thinking about his kind of admiration, his Anglophilia, his sort of love of Queen Victoria and the very German English royal family. Out of sort of as a what if, I was just going to ask if the English connection hadn't been so strong. So if his mother had been, I don't know, let's say Dutch rather than English, do you think that would have had any impact on the Kaiser, either psychologically or militarily?
Oh, that is an interesting question. I mean, especially as the royal families were so intertwined as well. I mean, it is obviously quite extreme in his case, given the role that Victoria played herself in Europe as the sort of grandmother of Europe, if you will. And of course, the sort of empire and the status of empire that came with that and was sort of pinned to some extent on her person as well. But his relationship with Russia is quite fractious as well. So that's kind of what makes me think, given that Nicholas was a first cousin of his as well, and he's got a similar kind of view. But I think what taints that to some extent is this inherent sort of arrogance / racism that people still felt at the time. So to see kind of Russia as a naturally inferior country and the Slavs as kind of naturally inferior people plays into that, regardless of the relationship or the kind of how related the two royal families are with Russia. Whilst I think with Britain he felt a personal affinity there, both because of the family connection, but also because they are kind of fellow Germanic people, and there's this kind of sense that they are related peoples that should be competing as well as kind of in a sort of friendly fashion, as well as doing stuff together. And he's kind of completely baffled by the idea that Britain would actually go to war with Germany. And to some extent you see that again with Hitler as well. He doesn't really fully believe that Britain will really go to war with Germany in the Second World War. And so I think there are other layers other than the personal family dynamics there.
For me, it's just curious because we've hated the French in a healthy and respectful manner for 1,000 years, and yet it always seems to be the Germans that we end up fighting. I guess that's where my pondering.
Depends when you're looking at. I mean, take Napoleon as a counter example to that.
True enough. Thank you, Katya, very much. Cheers.
No problem.
There's a question in the chat from William Brown asking, in your opinion, what are some of the best biographies of Wilhelm?
I didn't get to that at the end, did I? I won't share my screen again. My last slide, which I didn't quite get to, had two of them on there. There are really only two major ones. One is by Christopher Clark, is the one that I mentioned earlier, which is a political biography of Wilhelm, which I think is very good, because it's quite balanced in my view. I mean, there are people who sort of said that he hasn't quite gone far enough with his criticism of Wilhelm. I personally think it is very balanced. And the other one is by Röhl, who is half German himself, and has arguably written, well, not arguably, has written the most extensive biography of Wilhelm. I would say that read that with a pinch of salt because of his own background. He's got very, very strong views about Wilhelm, negative views about Wilhelm, which he argues very well and backs up very well, but it's just worth kind of pointing this out, that there's a sort of somewhat emotional angle to the way that he approaches Wilhelm. But read in conjunction, they are very good, both of them. And it's just worth pointing out again as well that Röhl is kind of more British than German. He's half British, half German, but kind of has his background is very much a British one. And Clark is an Australian. So the fact that there isn't really a major biography by a German historian on the last German Kaiser is in itself quite interesting, I think, about the way that Germany deals with its own past.
There's a question in the chat from Michael Arnold asking, do you think that Germany did issue the so-called blank check?
Well, they did. So it definitely happened, as in they sent a document to say that they basically, Austria has got unconditional support in its military dealings in the Balkans. What is interesting though is the actual motivation behind it, and I think that's where the sort of debate comes in, because you can either read that, as some historians have, including some German historians, Fritz Fischer most famously. You could read that in a way that it coerces and pushes Austria into the war with Serbia, in the sense that it sort of, puts pressure behind that ultimatum and behind the kind of entire situation, and says to Austria, act now. And it is actually followed up by a lot of political maneuvering, particularly from the Chancellor. And therefore you could argue that there is a warmongering element to that, as some historians have. However, again, I would be a bit cautious about that, because this is again angling for a war in the Balkans as opposed to a European war, because there's still certainly a complete assumption there from Wilhelm that Britain won't get involved, and that France will kind of literally just be knocked out quickly, and then have some terms imposed on it, and it won't lead to a protracted war in the West either. So yes, that's there, and yes, I think that is pushing Austria into not just letting the murder of their Archduke go, of the heir to the throne go, and therefore it is kind of moving Europe closer to the war that would eventually ensue, but I don't think with a view towards actually leading to the conflict that ensued in the end.
There's another question in the chat asking, did many German politicians visit him once he was in exile?
He became a bit of a celebrity. I mean, he was a celebrity, obviously, to start with. But, those like tea parties and things, it just became sort of a bit fashionable to just go there and say, oh, I've seen the Kaiser and whatever. And especially as that moved further into the past, nobody kind of seriously assumed that, or few people seriously assumed that the monarchy would be restored. And if it did, then not under him, but under his son or whatever, various other candidates that came into play. So people did, and not least because his second wife kind of was very keen to pretend that there was a court, and kind of upheld all of the protocol that came with it, as well. So yes, people did, and the kind of quick newsreel footage that I showed you there as well, that that just shows what media interest there was as well in the Kaiser's doings. So he very much became kind of like a relic of a time gone by that people just wanted to see before it was gone.
I think if it's okay with you, Katya, we've got time for one more question. Penelope has her hand up.
Hi, I just want to ask the question that how did Wilhelm's opinion towards Britain changed during the course of First World War, and especially after the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, as we know that quite a lot of Germans are resenting about it because of the harsh conditions. Did his opinions change with the Treaty of Versailles towards Britain?
Yeah, so briefly about the war itself. So initially, he was completely surprised / baffled by the fact that Britain declared war and got involved, because he just didn't see that coming. There were various diplomatic shortcomings there, because either side misunderstandings, various telegrams and messaging that didn't come through, right? So basically, he didn't see it coming. He didn't think that Britain would actually go to war with him. And when the first sort of early bombings that happened, so Zeppelins were basically sent over to Britain, and kind of the first bombs were dropped from the air. Wilhelm actually stipulated initially that they shouldn't be dropped on London, because he saw it, in a way that that's where his family is, i.e. the royal family, and therefore he didn't want them harmed. Never mind the rest of the population that lives there. But that's, I think, quite telling. That shows you how much he's switching back and forth again. This idea that he's kind of happy for Britain to be bombed, but then he thinks, oh, but what about my family there? And it's a very kind of personal, emotional, and irrational response to, okay, you can bomb this bit, but not this bit, sort of thing. And then even during the war, he kind of swaps back and forth between bragging about how many people were killed in what battle, or looking at the Navy in particular. He follows the naval engagements and so on and so forth. So that is there, and I think it just perpetuates the kind of love-hate relationship he had beforehand, but takes it to a new level. And then the Treaty of Versailles, of course, was seen by most Germans, and even more so by the Kaiser and by the royal family, as a injustice that needed to be undone. And this explains partially why they start sort of flirting with Nazism and with Hitler once he becomes powerful in the build up to his takeover in 1933. It's kind of this, it's not out of a sense of kind of embracing Nazism as an ideology, but out of a sense that the monarchy might be brought back and the sort of shame of Versailles might be undone.
Thank you so much.
In absolutely perfect timing, Katya. It's 7:29, so that just leaves me a minute just to thank everybody for coming. It's so nice for 50-odd people to be joining the Leicester branch for a talk this evening, and especially to thank you, Katya, for a really fascinating evening. It was so interesting to hear all your comments and the results of your research, so thank you. And good night, everybody. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks everybody for coming along and listening and asking some great questions.
Thanks so much, everyone. Good night.
Bye.